As a junior member, I'm going to covetously guard my 5 minutes. I won't get 6 or 7. So I want to start, Ms. Harman, with a comment that you made. If the people of, and I quote verbatim, if the people of Iran who elected their government by more than 50% in a four-way field want to change their government, let them do it. Are you implying that there are free and fair elections in Iran?
No, but I'm implying that. Oh.
I'm going to covetous. I'm not trying to be rude, and I respect your immense service to this body. But I want to be clear because the Iranians watch these hearings, right? So the Guardians Council approves individuals who wish to run for office in Iran. And as an example, 496 individuals wanted to run for president in 2009. 4 were approved. So it's not so simple, regime change, as winning an election. And I don't want to, and again, not meant to be disrespectful. I want to read from the comments of my colleague, who I think was nearly prescient when he wrote in 2015 the following. Now, under U.S., now as to law, under U.S. law, the only thing that's binding on the U.S. is a treaty that's designed as a treaty. So it says it's a treaty submitted to the Senate for ratification and gets 2/3 positive vote. This deal is not a treaty. It has no standing under U.S. law except as a handshake from the President. I continue from my colleague. The Vienna Convention of Law of Treaties provides a hierarchy of agreements. This deal is not a ratified treaty. It's not an unratified treaty. It's not an executive legislative agreement. It's the lowest form of international handshake. So I continue from my same colleague. You can be sure that Iran will violate this agreement or not based on whether it's in their interest, whether they think they'll get caught. No one around the Ayatollah will say, no, that would be a violation of international law. And so I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Sherman, because I think he's really been sort of omniscient as it relates to foreseeing what happens. Mr. Rademacher, do we know to a metaphysical certainty that Iran is in compliance with the terms of the JCPOA?
No, I don't.
And again, not trying to be rude, I got a finite amount of time. And we don't know that because military sites are off limits to inspections, correct?
They've declared that they will be off sites. There's been no request to inspect military.
And if there is an inspection request, how much time do the Iranians have to prepare?
I'm not sure, but they would have some time. The bigger question, though, is are there other sites that we don't know about at all?
That would be the next question.
To inspect.
And it initially contemplated was 24 days to prepare. My colleague, Mr. Sherman, very humorously, but I think accurately said, I could clean out my garage in 24 days. And so, again, I commend him for sort of having foresight. Let me ask you this, Link, because that's what you said you wanted somebody to call you. Is a nuclear-armed Iran consistent with the rhetoric from the mullahs, an existential threat to entities in the region as well as the nation-state of Israel, and depending upon the delivery mechanism, an existential threat to millions and millions of people in the United States?
As a technical, physical matter, of course it is.
Okay.
I've already explained why I think they need it for political reasons more than military reasons.
I understand. Again, and I know I'm sort of limiting these questions, but I'm limited in time. Does Iran have a documented history, Mr. Rademacher, of violating international agreements?
Well, when it came to in the nuclear area, they have a long history of deception and cheating on their international obligations with regard to nuclear safeguards.
And my good friend and colleague, Mr. Engel, pointed out that the well over $100 million in previous statements, that the well over $100 million that we released to Iran would go to fund activities that the Iranians have been engaged in for perpetuity, to include Hamas, Hezbollah, wreaking havoc in the region and globally. Can anyone on the panel, just for my own sort of intellectual curiosity, name a single terrorist entity other than Hezbollah, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Iranian government, which has the dubious distinction of having murdered people on every single inhabited continent? Can anybody? Or is Hezbollah it? Are the Iranians the only ones? Australia, South America? So I suppose, in conclusion, Mr. Rademacher, would you feel better about this agreement, as was indicated by my colleague, Ms. Frankel, as well as Mr. Deutsch and Mr. Series in 2015, if the inspection regime were more robust?
Certainly.
Would each of you feel better about this agreement if the fungible monies weren't freed to Iran that have historically gone to fund radical elements that murder people across the globe, quite literally, like Hamas, Hezbollah, et cetera? Ms. Harman, I saw you reaching for the button.
Of course I would.
And so if we can maintain some agreement and yet get a stronger agreement as it relates to things like ballistic missile technology, that would, in the estimation of all folks on the panel, be a step in the right direction.
Absolutely, but the question we've raised is whether the President's anticipated action this afternoon helps or hinders that goal.
Well, Ms. Harman, and I'll wrap up. Again, with complete respect for everybody on the panel, I would read from my friend and colleague, Mr. Deutsch, who wrote in 2015, "Many of my colleagues are trying to turn this into a partisan fight. People of good faith can disagree honestly. They should stop." We do not know what the actions of the president will be circa 2 p.m. this afternoon. I will be completely candid in speaking for or against them once I understand what they are. But in the meantime, trying to score political points, I think you'd all agree, is a bad idea. And we can do a little bit better with this thing that has been referred to as a deal and an agreement, but not a treaty. And it is indeed within our legal purview to attempt to do so by virtue of the nature of the underlying agreement. Is that not correct, ma'am? Anybody? And I'll wrap. And I'm done.
Yes, it's correct. And this committee, on a bipartisan basis, has stated a general position, which I certainly would commend, and I commended at the outset of my testimony, the bipartisanship, the long history of it, of this committee. I think it's an exemplary part of the House.
The only thing I would submit, and not to poke at you at all, is that we should not judge what the president's going to say before he's said it. That's all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.